All right. I am not going to start all over. A lot of what you heard already, you've heard. So I hope you liked it. This is Catherine Moore, what I call the first lady of science fantasy, because she didn't write science fiction exclusively. She wrote a lot of fantastic stories that are not justifiable, and we are going to try and dim the lights. But this is an autographed picture of Catherine from 1933. So this is right at the beginning of her career. If you feel that I'm going too fast through the slides, just sing out, let me know, and I'll dial it back. I talked about how Farnsworth Wright, this gentleman here, the editor of Weird Tales, purchased her first story. This is Wright in Chicago, roughly about 1940. Since Shambleau was her first story, and since I really don't have an interior illustration from the magazine, it never had one, I'm just going to show you how other publishers, both contemporary, post-1960, and modern, ultra-modern, you might say, have interpreted Shambleau. Do you mind if I do any spoilers on the story? Okay. Remember that when Northwest Smith, or NW, as Yarrow calls him, sees Shambleau running down the alleys, she's got her head covered in a turban or a bandana. And for better or for worse, illustrators of the story take advantage of what's underneath that bandana. So what you see here are a pretty faithful interpretation on your left from France, and another European edition on the right. This is a Galaxy novel reprint. Obviously, Davy Crockett and buckskins represented manliness and virility and what have you. I don't believe Northwest Smith in the story is ever described wearing this outfit, but you go with the times to make your buck. To the credit of the artist, if you know the story, what you see on her head, you know what you're looking at. If you haven't read the story, it's subtle enough that it just looks like hair. Here's some more foreign editions. An Italian edition on your right and another French edition on your left. I believe the French edition is from 1954. And what these are, Catherine Moore wrote few novels. All of her work is short story or novella form, so for her to have a book, they're collections. Her first book was a collection that we'll see in a moment or two called Judgment Night, and subsequent to that was a book from Gnome Press called Shambleau and Others, and this is what is getting reprinted over the years. And Shambleau and Others is a collection of both Northwest Smith stories and Jarrell stories. Nothing like subtle imagery on the left, huh? Obviously a Japanese cover from the mid-90s. I don't know how well it did for sales, but I'm not sure more of the state would have approved. And then on the right is another French cover where it's kind of no secret what might be under Jarrell's headdress, or under Shambleau's headdress, forgive me, the name slip. This is the issue of Weird Tales, where it all began. This is November 1933. Notice that it's just a generic cover. There's no authors, there's no titles. This Weird Tales cover could be for any story. It's definitely not for Shambleau, but this is what readers saw in the stands, not knowing that inside was Catherine's debut. As she wrote more and more stories of Northwest and Jarrell, still fewer of them had interior illustrations. One of the few ones, this one, Tree of Life, got an early Virgil Finlay. And this is one of the last of the Northwest Smith stories. Oddly enough, I think it's the only time in science fiction where a husband and wife of any genre wrote a short story, both called Tree of Life. If you look up the backlog of, I believe, Astonishing Stories in 1940, you'll find The Tree of Life by Paul Edmonds, which is Henry Cutner. These are the two covers for the Gnome Press editions, Shambleau and Others and Northwest of Earth. Apparently Northwest Smith of Earth was confusing, so Marty Greenberg and David Kyle agreed to shorten it. The illustrator for these editions is Rick Binkley, and prices on these are all across the board, all dependent on condition. Autographed are more valuable, obviously. And if you have these two books, barring 4 fanzine pieces or fragments, you will have all the Jarrell and Northwest stories. This is an early reprint from Avon Fantasy Reader of a story called Scarlet Dream, which is the second or third Northwest Smith story. Remember, Chamblot's hair is red. The Martian sands are red. There's red, or scarlet, in the story of this. And if Northwest, who is kind of featured, all crouched down and, hiding from those flames, if you read all the NW stories consecutively, you'll definitely see a pattern. NW gets into trouble, his buddy gets him out of a jam, and then they find out it's all being caused by some sort of evil vixen who has the hots for our hero and usually conquers him and has to be rescued. Here's a British edition of Chamblot. This is a paperback. Again, it could be for almost any story, but you can see, if you know that what's under her headdress is kind of displayed in the graphic down below at the bottom. Chamblot again, a little more explicit what you're getting into. If Northwest Smith could have seen this, he might not have chased her. The artist on this is Jim Burns, and this is from a late 80s reprint from Ace Books that sold very, very well for the day. More international editions. You can see that they're kind of playing on the fantasy tropes of the late 70s and early 80s. I don't believe that Northwest Smith ever carried a sword.
That's actually for a Paul Anderson paperback.
Is that what it is? It's recycled Paul Anderson artwork?
Yeah, that's for Pleasure Terra.
Ah, those crazy Italians. This is a Hispanic edition. Lovely. Obviously Japanese. These are 2002 and 2004 editions from the same publisher. Why they felt the need to redo the artwork is beyond me, but they're out there and collectors have them, I guess. More reprints of Chamblot. Here it's pretty explicit what you're getting into. As much as she's still got a humanoid face, she's got the green cat eyes and red snakes for hair. Who's familiar with Barbarella? Who's familiar with the cartoon strip and not the Jane Fonda movie? Ah, excellent. That's pretty good rep. I'm told that the artist of the Barbarella comic strip is the same artist behind this French graphic adaptation of Chamblot. And you can see the cover, and they printed it fairly cheaply in two-tones. But on the cover, we've got, good-looking girl playing guitar, not really expositive of what you're going to get on the inside. On the image on the right, fairly good description of Chamblot being chased through the alleys of Mars. And then, probably 11 pages into the adaptation, in translation, I haven't read it in French, you see Chamblot in all her hideous glory. And if you know the story, you can see at the bottom, on the right-hand page, what has happened to Northwest Smith. He basically not only is seduced and overpowered by Chamblot, but she basically becomes a mass of writhing worms and just basically absorbs his body. And it looks like curtains for our hero. To be continued. What you've got here is one of the only covers of C.L. Moore on Weird Tales, and this is for a Jarrell story called Black God's Kiss. We all know the illustrator or artist is Margaret Brundage. I don't believe this image is known to survive in a private collection, but stranger things have happened. But pretty faithful image. Jarrell is a red-headed warrior, color red again, and not that she worships this pseudo-Buddha with the big single eye, but to find out more, read the story. Here we've got paperbacks that collect just the Jarrell stories. You can see these are probably published about 25 years apart. Still the same tropes, same motifs, same designs, if you will, but different approaches to style, different approaches to typography. The fact that these types of stories from the 1930s can get published in paperback in the mid-60s and again in the early 80s kind of shows the lasting legacy of Catherine Moore's fiction just from Weird Tales alone. This is 1937 in Wisconsin. I'm pretty sure the gentleman on the far left is Harold Gower, who until recently was still alive. He was involved in Wisconsin politics and active in fandom back in the day, and had a very active blog and website even in his advanced years, and had fond memories and well-documented records of his time in early science fiction. I kind of dropped the ball earlier, but who's the gentleman second from your left? That's a very, very young Robert Bloch who could stop skipping meals and not hinge his belt up so high. Obviously next to him is Catherine Moore, and the gentleman on the far right in a bad need of a haircut is Henry Kuttner. This is a fanzine from obviously June 1936, and I just put it on here because she was involved in publications in fandom and in fanzines, both on both coasts, New York and California. And this one is important because there's a pretty short but meaty interview with her where a lot of facts that we knew about her for the following 60 years came from. And this is another issue of that same magazine, and this is obviously the 3rd anniversary issue from September 1933. And for this special issue, and this magazine was edited by Mort Weisinger and Julie Schwartz and Connie Rupert and other leading fans of the day like Ackerman and Ray Palmer. And there are 2 original pieces of fiction in this, and they're both round robins. You can see in the circles in the middle of both graphics, there's one that says SF and one that says WF, science fiction, weird fiction. And both types of stories are in this issue, and 5 authors each contributed to each story. Does anybody know, we know it's called The Challenge from Beyond, does anybody know the 5 authors who wrote the weird fiction version in the story? One of them's obviously C.L. Moore. Lovecraft.
A. Merritt.
A. Merritt.
Robert E. Howard.
Robert E. Howard and Frank Belknap Long. Hot man. Let's see if you're right. Hey! I want to take a stab at who wrote the science fiction story in the issue. Which Clark? No. No, Evan Hamilton wrote a round-robin conclusion for this magazine called Cosmos, which Catherine Moore was not part of, but thank you for playing. I don't blame anybody for not knowing. I had to look them up. Stanley Weinbaum, Donald Wandrive, Doc Smith, Harl Vincent, he who? I know who he is, and you know who he is, but the guy out the window doesn't know who he is. And Murray Leinster. And it's available online, it's public domain, and Necronomicon Press did a deluxe edition in 1990. Definitely worth seeking out, and not just for the novelty. The weird fiction version actually is pretty good. Switching hands. Alright, what we're going to shoot through now are some slides just of the interior cover art. Obviously a story called Miracle in 3 Dimensions. This appeared in Strange Stories in 1939, and this is the beginning of Catherine Moore's departure from that adventurous, sexed up fiction that she was famous for Weird Tales, and she started to write about the problems and complexities in a temporal Jeopardy story. This is not a neglected story because it's available in the best of C.L. Moore, so it's not exactly forgotten, but it's seldom discussed. Greater Than Gods appeared in the July 1939 issue of Astounding Stories. Consensual thoughts are that this is John W. Campbell's first issue of Astounding that launches the Golden Age. In this issue was also Black Destroyer by A.E. Van Vogt, Lifeline by Robert A. Heinlein. Isaac Asimov had a story, a real powerhouse issue. And with all that other, legendary talent and big, important stories, this one gets kind of lost in the shuffle. And these are just additional illustrations from the story. World War II was on the horizon in 1939. Totalitarian, dictatorial tyrannies and governments are all the rage in Europe. And in America, we definitely fear this. And Catherine Moore head-on addresses the problems of being a dictator in foreign lands in a number of stories, and astounding. I believe this artwork is by Charles Schneeman, who did a lot of illustrations for Doc Smith Lensman stories. Wish I had the interior artwork to go with this, but what you got is her only appearance in Unknown, called Fruit of Knowledge, and it's also available in the Best of C.L. Moore. This is the interior illustration from an astounding story called The Bright Illusion, one of the more trippier stories until she and Henry Kuttner wrote as Lewis Paget, the Fairy Chessman, with some pretty trippy dialogue and imagery in that. Later on, we'll come to it in a moment, Catherine Moore wrote a novel in 1957 called Doomsday Morning about a dramatic troupe that is hired by a totalitarian government to try and ferret out an anti-bomb or anti-tech software, even though it's not called much. They call it anti-com. And the performers in Doomsday Morning put on a play called The Bright Illusion. So she's reversing her recurrence on herself. We're coming into early 1940s, approaching the mid-40s. By now, Catherine Moore and Henry Kuttner have been a couple for over 2 years, and her byline as a solo artist, if you will, is starting to fade. They're putting more and more fiction together. Pearl Harbor's happened. People are getting drafted soon. Powerhouse writers for Astounding like Heinlein and DeCamp and Asimov are going to go into service, and Kuttner and Moore, until Kuttner did get drafted late in the day, start kicking up the wordage and publish many stories in a single issue under pseudonyms like Lewis Paget, Lawrence O'Donnell, even as Henry Kuttner, as a pseudonym for their collaboration. We saw the cover by Hubert Rogers just a moment ago for There Shall Be Darkness. I'm just going to blast through some of the interiors here. Nothing says science fiction like shooting dragons with a magic wand. And getting blackjack by druids. Which, believe me, at your peril, that happened to me this morning. They hit my laptop, actually. You know what happened next. And again, we're coming to one of the last few byline stories by C.L. Moore, and it's called Judgment Night. This was a 2-part serial in 1943, Astounding. And this one, again, pretty trippy. It's like a kitchen sink space opera. Strong female protagonist belonging to a galactic royalty. There's some really fantastic science at the beginning with anti-grav worlds orbiting other planets that are barren, and it leads to, the end of civilization as we know it. What you see is 2 editions of that story, Judgment Night, repackaged on the left as a Gnome Press hardcover with very early Kelly Freas artwork. This is 1952. He had just illustrated for the first time, but it's not his first painting. He had done Weird Tales earlier. And then we have a latter-day painting from Dell Science Fiction in 1969, which actually omits one of the stories in the Judgment Night Gnome collection. In case you weren't aware, a facsimile edition, I think it's like $30, which is a deal, of Judgment Night in a slipcase has been produced by David Kyle's son from a company called Red Jacket Books. And I definitely recommend you support their wares. Lawrence O'Donnell was a pen name adopted by the Kuttners. They used it on a number of works. When Judgment Night was published in 1952, this particular story is from Astounding 1950. Catherine Moore pretty much determined what stories of hers bore the O'Donnell pen name, and they got put into Judgment Night. And we've just got a selection of slides of the interior illustrations from Judgment Night. And I apologize, that image is a lot bigger on my screen. So is that one. When men wore shoulder pads and drove submarines. All right, I mentioned how Lawrence O'Donnell was exclusively a C.L. Moore pen name. This is Vintage Season, which is pretty much acknowledged, along with a short story called No Woman Born, as Moore's masterpiece. A lot of Golden Age science fiction writers have the reputations because they invented one or more singular tropes or storytelling motifs. Here, without spoiling the ending, Catherine Moore writes about a common man who is approached by an uncommon woman. She's tall, she's graceful, she's beautiful, she is almost unearthly because she is. And a vintage season, obviously you've got a chalice of wine, hence the metaphor. That woman is part of a troupe of people who have evolved so much and morally decayed so much that their idea of a holiday is to time travel to the past and witness, for entertainment, catastrophic events. And that's not spoiling the story. The real heart of the story is how our hero, our protagonist, reacts to the situation and what he intends to do about it. For those that know the story, you know how it ends. For those that really know the story, there was a film made of this with Jeff Daniels in 1992. Had a bunch of names, poor distribution. They use the story as the basis for the first half of the movie, and then they make their own ending. Be warned. You can rent it or DVD it or Netflix it. It's called Grand Tour or The Big Adventure. Depends on which cable station they wanted to sell it to. You'll notice that I haven't talked much about Henry Kuttner's contribution to Catherine Moore's writing career. This is Catherine's 100th centennial. We're not celebrating their marriage or their output as a couple. We can do that at another time. But I thought it was interesting just to juxtapose and give you some backstory on this novel, or novel-length story called The Mask of Circe, or Circe. And on the left, we have Startling Stories with a cover by Earl K. Berge, very much of its time, despite the vintage Roman. We've got the girl in a sheer negligee. Come forward into the late 60s, and we've got a full-color paperback cover for the same story. And it is night and day what editors thought represented science fiction for the same text. Oh, and it is believed that Catherine Moore actually wrote all of this novel, even though it's published by Henry Kuttner. This is the artwork of Hubert Rogers for another Lawrence O'Donnell story called Promised Land. Did I say Hubert Rogers? Shame! Catherine Moore, shame. This is at Cartier. Sorry about that. I'm looking at an angle. Do I get a pass on that?
No.
No, thank you. I don't deserve one. This is Promised Land, but the illustrations are by Cartier, who is one of the brilliant artists of the Street Smith Pulps. Big shadow illustrator. There are those in the room who know more about him. There are those in the room who met him and knew him. Some very, very well. I never did, and I envy you. But I believe Promised Land had 3 illustrations, and he had his own unique flair for caricature and exaggerated emotion that really suited the kind of stories that Kuttner and Moore were turning into John Campbell. Speaking of turning in, we have the couple at work. It's obviously a stage shot. This is their home in California. This is roughly 1952. I can't imagine that they type side by side. I mean, how can you collaborate on a single manuscript? Photograph taken on the same day in the same location. This was used on several book jackets. I used it on Detour to Otherness last year. You can see they're a little older, or in Cutner's case, a lot older. He had come out of war service a little different than he went in, emotionally. This is 1956, if not 1957, and this is on the campus of USC. And this photograph came from the USC archives. Not only did they go to USC in the mid-50s on the GI Bill, they were also on staff and later faculty. They taught English, they taught screenwriting, they taught creative writing. Cutner had just finished his master's and was submitting his ideas for his PhD. Allegedly, he was felled by a heart attack while on the Warner Brothers lot. In addition to teaching at USC, they had been put into the writer's stable with Lee Brackett also on the lot working on Rio Bravo. And allegedly, Cutner took ill, was taken to the hospital, and died of a heart attack. He was 44 years old. I picked this image to show you, number one, what the original artwork looked like. This is courtesy of Craig Poole's website. And you can see what the publisher did with typography and placement of text. This is unique because this is called Beyond Earth's Gates, originally published as The Portal in the Picture in Startling Stories. And it's very much one of the 10 A. Merritt pastiches, if you will, that they wrote of a fantastic adventure of a guy displaced from Earth into a far and distant land. Or is it in his mind? But look at the byline. Beyond Earth's Gates by Lewis Paget and C.O. Moore. What? Go figure. The Pulp had it published by Henry Cutner. What you have here is the Ballantine hardcover and matching paperback of a collection called No Boundaries from late in their writing career. And again, I selected this one because Catherine Moore's name is restored to a byline on a book. She has become marketable again, and this is one of the few times a Cutner Moore story, Home is the Hunter, is first appeared. It didn't have a magazine publication originally. And this is the same book with a European or British paperback. In case you didn't know, both images are by Richard Powers. This is not. But somebody tried really hard. We're in 1957, and Henry Cutner is only going to be alive for another year, and their fiction output has slowed tremendously, which it only could, because they were at peak performance, if you will, for over 10 years, working for John Campbell and other editors. Here, we have Henry Cutner and C.O. Moore, cover story on the right, and both their names at the top right of the left-hand image and front and center on the right-hand image. And these are two classic stories of theirs that they go in and out of print, but when they're selected amongst the best, one or both of these is always chosen. This comes from the Wilson Tucker collection of photographs that Robin Wayne Bailey in Kansas City owns, and I appreciate him letting me use this. Believe this is in Southern California. And in addition to those two, I'm going to go back a page. In addition to these two stories that they published in the late 50s before Cutner passed away, they had also written some original novels for Perma books. They were paperback originals. There were 4 of them, and they all featured the adventures of a psychoanalyst working in San Francisco named Michael Gray. And the books are called The Murder of Eleanor Pope, The Murder of Anne Avery, and Murder of a Wife and Murder of a Mistress. And they've, except for Murder of a Wife as a hardcover from Greg for the libraries in the 80s, they were never reprinted. And you can find them beat up for $1, and you can, drop $25-30 for an original. Small commercial. On Tuesday, I just got a contract to reprint them as 1 volume. And Robert Guinness may be doing the cover art. He's not a young man, so we'll see what happens. I mentioned Doomsday Warning earlier. I really like this book. It's been in and out of print itself, but it's out of print right now. I'll see what I can do about that. But you can see the comedy face of the theatrical troupe in a mushroom cloud on the hardcover on the left. On the right is the first paperback printing with Richard Powers cover. They got reprinted again by Popular Library. Amazingly fresh and contemporary with a lot of the political troubles facing this society on a national and global basis. Outstanding work. And the last work published by C.L. Moore, solo, under her own name. This is C.L. Moore in circa 1977, obviously with Forrest Ackerman, and I don't know where she's at or what she's doing, but she's being honored. And we know she's basically being honored for C.L. Moore because she hasn't written anything since 1963. But this comes out, which I think is a travesty. It's supposed to be Northwest Smith and Shambleau on the Science Fiction Book Club edition of The Best of C.L. Moore, and it's actually recycled artwork from a softcore film called Flesh Gordon. Thankfully, the editors at Ballantine Books commissioned the brothers Hildebrandt to paint this image for the paperback reprint of The Best of C.L. Moore, and this represents a story that I mentioned only briefly earlier called No Woman Born. And it involves a world-famous dancer who was maimed and essentially killed in a fire, but they salvage her brain and put her inside a mechanical body that can perform way beyond the expectations of the designer. And the story involves what happens to the female psyche of a vain, world-famous talent now trapped in what amounts to a better body. These are here just to have shown you what turned into her works. These are Don Grant editions of the Northwest Smith on the left and Jurel on the right from 1981. Catherine Moore was guest of honor at Denvention in 81, the Worldcon in Denver. And understandably, they wanted to honor her with really class editions of her work. If you ever see these books, they've got illustrated end papers and glossy tip-ins and what have you. And Mike Resnick, of all people, spearheaded this and took his name off the project. Remember I said there were 4 fragments or orphan stories of Northwest Smith. And at this point, 1981, Catherine may have been suffering the beginnings of Alzheimer's dementia. And she declared by fiat, since it's her work, that unless the stories bore her byline alone, then she didn't write them. And no cajoling, persuading, threatening from historians like Ackerman or Sam Moskowitz would persuade her otherwise. And the project was going to die if they tried to put those stories in. So those 4 fragments of the Smith and Jurel stories remain unreprinted until recently in 2007. These are pictures of Catherine at the Denvention. The gentleman on the left standing up is Don Grant. We are soon to identify the brunette standing behind Catherine. I believe it might be her stepdaughter's future mother-in-law. If that makes enough of a... Is it? It could be. I don't know. Okay, if it's Alicia Austin, thank you, mystery solved. I'm going to cut ahead to what I'm looking at here. All right. Has anybody in the room met or known Catherine beyond standing in an autograph line, for example, at a convention? Okay, I got Gay Haltman and Rusty. I got to ask you, did you ever meet her second husband, Thomas Reggie?
No.
All right. Do you know anything about it? The answer was no.
We knew quite a bit about her because Joe Haldeman, Gay Haldeman, and I spent quite a time interviewing her, but we never did anything with it. And the answer to you, the direct answer to your question, no, we never met her.
Okay. I mentioned, thank you. The answer was Gay and Rusty and Joe. had met and interviewed Catherine at length, and they never met her second husband. How much time do I have left?
Finish up.
All right. I'll keep it short if I can. Interviewing her stepdaughter, Carol Ann. Henry Cutner died in 1958. She continued working at USC, teaching classes, both hers and taking over Henry's, and continued that at least until 1963, probably later into the end of the 60s. She was also a docent guide at the Los Angeles Zoo as a volunteer, and she was coming down the Los Angeles freeway in 1962 and had a flat tire. A gentleman drove up and helped her out, and that was Thomas Reggie. Thomas Reggie was not a physician, as some people who think they know what they're talking about would say. Catherine Moore's second husband, at the time they met, was married to another woman with their 2 children, and he had a previous marriage as well. And he was an 8th grade dropout and served in the infantry in World War II. And in 1947, he operated a business until his death in 2003 as Checkers, which was a uniform rental and cleaning service. So he would rent garments, gowns, floor mats, towels, rags to gas stations, garages, hospitals, corporations. And I can tell you from being in that business 20 years ago, or for the last 20 years, you can make a lot of money. So money was not a problem. And if money's not a problem, and if you probably are burned out from 15, 20 years of high production writing, you probably don't want to write anymore. There's people that say that Tom Reggie hated science fiction and hated science fiction writers, hated Moore, his first husband, and denied seeing his works reprinted. Nothing is further from the truth. Anytime a contract was offered to Tom Reggie for his wife's work or her first marriage, he signed it. So why aren't there more Cutner reprints from the time Cutner died to today? The agent who repped Cutner, who I work well with, I'm not going to badmouth him, but the agent who repped Cutner is Don Congdon, who also reps Ray Bradbury, Walter Miller, Richard Matheson, powerhouse writers that command high fees and steady royalties. They're too busy. And that's just the science fiction authors they represented. One short story I won't go into, Don Congdon got into a fight with Jackie Onassis and won. So they're not going to take time out to work on a small potatoes contract and have to chase down 3-figure, 4-figure royalties. It's not worth their time. Tom Reggie's a millionaire. He and his wife don't need the money. So unless it's something she wants to be a part of and something to do, that's the explanation why there wasn't a lot of Cutner reprinted. And having said that, there was a lot of Cutner and Moore reprinted over the years, just not to everybody who wanted to reprint it. They wouldn't pay what they felt, the agents felt it was worth. Sparing a lot of details because they are personal, but after the marriage, Catherine lived with Tom Reggie, but she also had her own apartment. She did continue to write, but it wasn't for commercial publication. When Carol Ann, who was roughly 10 years old when her father and Catherine Moore married, she came to call Catherine Moore Mom. She was more mother than her own mother, even though she only saw her every other weekend, 6 weeks in the summer, and they worked out the holidays. And Catherine forbid Carol Ann to read any of her books until she turned 18. And I said, well, of course, that creates desire and demand and passion for the works that you want to read them. You didn't wait till you're 18, did you? She's like, yeah, I was a good girl. Okay, so you turned 18 and you read them. What did you think? And she's like, I loved them. I never knew my stepmother, could write this stuff. So I finished a book, and I would give it to her and say, okay, which parts did you write? And the answer almost every time was, well, we both wrote them, but I think I wrote more. And Carol Ann's like, well, what's that mean? And I don't know if she winked or twinkled, but right now that's all we know. There's probably no way, thank you, John, there's probably no way to know of their collaborations, who wrote what and in what percentages. but it's fun to try and find out. So she came back into the science fiction community in the late 70s for a variety of latter-day awards. The invention in 81 had to be a big highlight. And despite a scattering of reprints, nothing much was done until roughly 2006, 2007. And both Kuttner and Moore are getting a bit of a, if not Indian summer, certainly a renaissance in their works coming back into print, sometimes affordably. And Tom Reggie passed away in 2003. He once got paid $75,000 for the film rights to Mimsy Where the Burro Goes, which was filmed as The Last Mimsy. I'm sure he liked the money, but he could have lived without it. He never saw the movie finished. After his passing, his daughter, Carol Ann, was not named the executor, nor the beneficiary. It's a complex situation. And an aunt of Carol Ann's, sister of Tom Reggie, was named executor. And when it came time to sell the houses, sell the cars, etc., the aunt asked Carol Ann, "Do you want the literary estate?" It did $100 last year. In 2004. That's what the Kuttner Moore estate generated in revenue, was $100. Now you see why the estate or the agency may not want to aggressively pursue it. Carol Ann said, absolutely. And she sent a letter that some of us in the room saw in various Pulp forums that she now was the executor and she was looking to restore her mother's legacy. And I think she's done a pretty good job so far, and it's only going to get better. One thing I neglected to share, and it's still a mystery. Henry Kuttner died in 1958. Haven't seen the letter, but according to Carol Ann, prior to Kuttner's death, he and Catherine were being investigated by the IRS. The IRS wanted to get an explanation of where their new income had come from. Their return filed in '57 had a $300,000 increase over the year prior. And they wrote a lot of fiction, but even at 3 times prevailing wages or prevailing rates in that year, it couldn't account for that kind of cash. So I don't think it's anything insidious or sinister. Pretty sure it's probably one of the relatives dying and donating their estate or rights or something. Some wad of cash came into Hank and Kat's life, and they probably just didn't handle it accordingly. Henry Kuttner had a relative, Lawrence Dorsey, who ran a literary agency, and he folded it at about that time in the late 50s. So without further investigation, that's my best guess where this windfall came from. But just imagine, your husband's passed away, you got $300,000 or more in the bank. Do you want to keep on writing science fiction? I'm grateful for the work she wrote. I'll take any questions if we've got time. Sir?
How much script writing did you do?
The question was, how much script writing did she do? And the answer is, some. I didn't talk about any of that. I felt pressed for time, but if you mentioned it, I'll talk about it. She got a job with her husband working for Warner's. They were called in to work on Rappaccini's Daughter, which is always the dead dog script that they give you before you get fired. No one's ever cracked it and made a movie of it. And then after Hank died, she got a number of television jobs working on Maverick, 77 Sunset Strip, another Western I'm blanking on at the moment, Sugarfoot, a lot of Sugarfoots. And certainly enjoyed it, but, once she married in '63 to a rather wealthy man, doesn't need to work for Hollywood anymore. Any other questions? Tom?
When you discussed Kuttner's death, you used the term allegedly as far as cause is concerned. Are you implying that there's something more beyond that, or was that just...
No, there's no implication. It's just people say he had a stroke, people say he had a heart attack, people say he died in his sleep. I haven't locked down where and how and the way he died, and I really don't care that much. That's kind of ghoulish. If it comes out in research and conversation, it's nice to document it, but I'm not in a rapid rush to find out. I I guess I'm trying to allude to that there's been a lot of obscura and false reporting about their later years, both as a couple and as a widow. And I'm happy to, learn some facts as the family knows them and bring them to you. Sir.
I noticed the first volume of correspondence between John Campbell and a number of employers came out, and I always waited for the second volume. I found out it came out on microfilm years later. Have you ever seen any correspondence by Campbell to or from them?
The question is, there's a volume 1 of John Campbell letters that came out from Perry Chaplain in '86, I think. Volume 2 came out in '95, and volume 3 only has Campbell Heinlein correspondence. In volume 1, there are a few letters from from Campbell to Kuttner. And there are letters from Campbell to other writers talking about Kuttner's death, with all sorts of gossip, if you will.
But no real indication of influence, comments on rewriting, comments on style writing.
I'm not aware of Campbell. Well, Campbell allegedly never rewrote anybody except Doc Smith. Yeah. If he didn't like a story, he would tell you how he wanted to change and have you do the work. That may still be true, I don't know. Any other questions? I got a question. Go ahead, Lisa.
You were talking, what's the story, Judgment Night?
Judgment Night is a 2-part serial and astounding.
Who did you say reprinted it?
It's reprinted by Red Jacket Books or Red Jacket Press. I think they're out of New Jersey. And they've also done 3 Lensman books by the owner's father, David Kyle, and facsimiles of Rhodes by Seabury Quinn, and Children of the Atom by Wilmar Shiras. You're welcome. Good question. Great book, worth seeking out. Great.
Anything else you do have coming out in the future?
Always got books coming out in the future. I mentioned the Michael Gray Murder Mysteries will be out in 2012. I have an opportunity to do a 3-volume collected solo works of C.L. Moore beginning in 2014. It all depends if you guys buy the books that come before, if I can afford to do them. Because, remember, publishers bigger than me failed to publish Catherine Moore. And the same people who handled her 20 years ago are still in charge, and you got to pay them what they think she's worth. I'm happy to do it. I got a question. Yeah, everybody got a red ticket?
Yeah.
Does anybody not have a red ticket? Oh, I could be a bit. You don't have a red ticket? Oh, man. You got a gold ticket? All right. It's a ruse. There won't be any prizes for 1 or 2 winners. Everybody who put up with this, thank you. For every one of you here, exclusive to this room. This isn't going to be for sale. If you want one, muck them in the hallway if you didn't get one here. And this is a 20-page chapter by a good friend of mine from the University of Washington in St. Louis, go figure, named Jennifer Jodell. And she got her master's in December, and her thesis was, if I may read it, Interdeterminate Identities in the Work of C.L. Moore. I asked her, does that mean you like her work? So what I asked her to do, and she was happy to do it, was to draft part of her thesis called The Significance of a Writer, C.L. Moore. And if you just want to come up and give me your ticket, I will give you your book. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for putting up with the technical difficulties. Thank you, Mike and John Gunnison, for getting it to happen.
I think it was worth the wait.